Hello, Year 6. I'm going to be reading chapter 5 for you today in Wind in the Willows, and this chapter is called Dulce Domum. And dulce in Latin means sweet, and domum means home. So this chapter is called Sweet Home. So maybe that will give you a little clue as to what we're going to read about in this chapter. I'm going to read the first part of this chapter today, and then the second part of the chapter will go up tomorrow. So make sure you return to the YouTube channel to hear the last part of chapter 5. The sheep ran huddling together against the hurdles, blowing out thin nostrils and stamping with delicate forefeet, their heads thrown back and a light steam rising from the crowded sheep pen into the frosty air. As the two animals hastened by in high spirits with much chatter and laughter. They were returning across country after a long day's outing with Otter, hunting and exploring on the wide uplands, where certain streams tributary to their own river had their first small beginnings. And the shades of the short winter day were closing in on them, and they still had some distance to go. Plodding at random across the plough, they had heard the sheep and had made for them. And now, leading from the sheep pen, they had found a beaten track that made walking a lighter business, and responded, moreover, to that small inquiring something which all animals carry inside of them, saying unmistakably, "Yes, quite right, this path leads home." "It looks as if we're coming into a village," said the mole, somewhat dubiously, slackening his pace, as the track that had in time become a path, and then had developed into a lane, now handed them over to the charge of a well-metalled road. The animals did not hold with the villages, and their own highways, thickly frequented as they were, took an independent course, regardless of the church, post office, or public house. "Oh, never mind," said the rat. "At this season of the year, they're all safe indoors by this time, sitting round the fire, men, women, and children, dogs and cats and all. We shall slip through all right, without any bother or unpleasantness. And we can have a look at them through their windows, if you like, and see what they're doing." The rapid nightfall of mid-December had quite beset the little village as they approached it on soft feet over the first thin fall of powdery snow. Little was visible but squares of a dusky orange-red on either side of the street, where the firelight or lamplight of each cottage flowed through the casements into the dark world without. Most of the low latticed windows were innocent of blinds, and to the lookers in from outside, the inmates gathered around the tea table, absorbed in handiwork or talking with laughter and gesture, had each that happy grace which is the last thing the skilled actor shall capture, that natural grace which goes with perfect unconsciousness of observation. Moving at will from one theatre to another, the two spectators, so far from home themselves, had something of wistfulness in their eyes as they watched a cat being stroked, a sleepy child picked up and huddled off to bed, or a tired man stretch and knock out his pipe on the end of a smouldering log. But it was from one little window, with its blind drawn down, a mere blank transparency on the night, that the sense of home with the little curtained world within walls, the larger stressful world of outside nature shut out and forgotten, most pulsated. Close against the white blind hung a bird cage, clearly distinct and recognisable, even to yesterday's dull-edged lump of sugar. On the middle perch the fluffy occupant, head tucked well into his feathers, seemed so near to them as to be easily stroked had they tried, even the delicate tips of his plumped-out plumage pencilled plainly on the illuminated screen. As they looked, the sleepy little fellow stirred uneasily, woke, shook himself and raised his head. They could see the gape of his tiny beak as he yawned in a bored sort of way, looked around and then settled his head into his back again, while the ruffled feathers gradually subsided into perfect stillness. Then a gust of bitter wind took them in the back of the neck, a small sting of frozen sleet on their skin woke them as from a dream, and they knew their toes to be cold and their legs tired, and their own home distant a weary way. Once beyond the village, where the cottages ceased abruptly, on either side of the road they could smell through the darkness the friendly fields again, and they braced themselves for the long last stretch, the home stretch, the stretch that we know is bound to end. Sometime, in the rattle of the door latch and the sudden firelight and the sight of familiar things greeting us as long-absent travellers from far over sea. They plodded along steadily and silently, each of them thinking his own thoughts. The moles ran a good deal on supper, as it was pitch black, and it was all a strange country to him as far as he knew, and he was following obediently in the wake of the rat, leaving the guidance entirely to him. As for Rat, he was walking a little way ahead, as his habit was, his shoulders humped, his eyes fixed on the straight grey road in front of him. So he did not notice poor Mole when suddenly the summons reached him, and he took like an electric shock. We others, who have long lost the more subtle of the physical senses, have not even proper terms to express an animal's intercommunications with his surroundings, living or otherwise, and have only the word smell, for instance, to include a whole range of delicate thrills which murmur in the nose of an animal day and night, summoning, warning, inciting, repelling. It was one of these mysterious fairy calls from out in the void that suddenly reached Mole in the darkness, making him tingle through and through with its very familiar appeal, even while yet he could not clearly remember what it was. He stopped dead in his tracks, his nose searching hither and thither in the efforts to recapture the fine filament, the telegraphic current that had so strongly moved him. A moment, and he had caught it again, and with it this time came recollection in fullest flood. Home. That was what they meant. Those caressing appeals, those soft touches wafted through the air, those invisible little hands pulling and tugging all one way. Why, it must be quite close to him, for at that moment his old home that he had hurriedly forsaken and never sought again, that day when he first found the river. And now it was sending out its scouts and its messengers to capture him and bring him in. Since his escape on that bright morning, he had hardly given it a thought. So absorbed had he been in his new life, in all its pleasures, its surprises, its fresh and captivating experiences. Now, with a rush of old memories, how clearly it stood up before him in the darkness, shabby indeed, and small and poorly furnished, and yet his, the home that he had made for himself, the home he had been so happy to get back to after a day's work, and the home he had been happy with. And the home had been happy with him too, evidently, and was still missing him and wanted him back, and was telling him so through his nose, sorrowfully and reproachfully, but with no bitterness or anger, only with a plaintive reminder that it was there and wanted him back. The call was clear, the summons was plain. He must obey it instantly and go. "Ratty!" he called, full of joyful excitement. "Hold on! Come back! I want you quick!" "Oh, come along, Mole, do," replied the rat cheerfully, still plodding along. Please stop, Ratty," pleaded the poor Mole in anguish of heart. "You don't understand. It's my home, my old home. I've just come across the smell of it, and it's close by here, really quite close, and I must go to it. I must. Oh, come back, Ratty, please come back." The rat was by this time very far ahead, too far ahead to clearly hear what the Mole was calling, too far to catch the sharp note of painful appeal in his voice, and he was much taken up with the weather, for he too could smell something suspiciously like approaching snow. "Mole, we really mustn't stop now, really," he called back. "We'll come for it tomorrow, whatever it is you've found. And I daren't stop now, it's late, and the snow's coming on again, and I'm not sure of the way. And I want your nose, Mole, so come on quick, there's a good fellow." And the rat pressed forward on his way without waiting for an answer. Poor Mole stood alone in the road, his heart torn asunder, and a big sob gathering somewhere low down within him, to leap up to the surface presently, he knew, in a passionate escape. But even under such a test as this, his loyalty to his friend stood firm. Never for a moment did he dream of abandoning him. Meanwhile, the wafts of his old home pleaded, whispered, conjured, and finally claimed him imperiously. He dared not tarry longer within their magic circle. With a wrench that tore his very heartstrings, he set his face down the road and followed submissively in the track of the rat, while faint, thin little smells, still dogging his retreating nose, reproached him for his new friendship and his callous forgetfulness. With an effort he caught up to the unsuspecting rat, who began chattering cheerfully about what they could do when they got back, and how jolly a fire of logs in the parlour would be, and a supper he meant to eat, never noticing his companion's silence and distressful state of mind. At last, however, when they had gone somewhat considerable way further, they were passing some tree stumps at the edge of the copse that bordered the road. He stopped and said kindly, "Look here, Mole, my old chap, you seem dead tired. No talk left in you, and your feet are dragging like lead. We'll sit down here for a minute and rest. The snow has held off so far, and the best part of our journey is over." The mole subsided forlornly on a tree stump and tried to control himself, for he felt it surely coming. The sob that he had fought for so long refused to be beaten. Up and up, it forced its way into the air, and then another, and others thick and fast, till poor Mole at last gave up the struggle and cried, freely and helplessly and openly, now that he knew that it was all over, and he had lost what he could hardly be said to have found. The rat, astonished and dismayed at the violence of Mole's paroxysm of grief, did not dare to speak for a while. At last he said, very quietly and sympathetic, "What is it, old fellow? Whatever can be the matter? Tell us your trouble, and let me see what I can do." Poor Mole found it difficult to get any words out between the upheavals of his chest that followed one upon another so quickly, and held back his speech and choked it at the same time. "I know it's a shabby, dingy little place," he sobbed forth at last brokenly. "Not like your cosy quarters, or Toad's beautiful hall, or Badger's great house, but it was my own little home, and I was fond of it, and I went away and forgot all about it. And when I smelt it suddenly, on the road when I called you and you wouldn't listen, Rat, and everything came back to me with a rush, and I wanted it. Oh dear, oh dear. And then you wouldn't turn back, Ratty, and I had to leave it, though I was smelling it all the time. I thought my heart would break. We might have just gone and had one look at it, Ratty, only one look. It was close by, but you wouldn't turn back, Ratty. You wouldn't turn back. Oh dear, oh dear." Recollection brought fresh waves of sorrow and sobs again that took full charge of him, preventing further speech. The rat stared straight in front of him, saying nothing, only patting Mole gently on the shoulder. After a time he muttered gloomily, "I see it all now. What a pig I have been. A pig, that's me. Just a pig, a plain pig." He waited till Mole's sobs became gradually less stormy and more rhythmical. He waited till the last sniffs were frequent and sobs only intermittent. When he rose from his seat and remarking carelessly, "Well, now we'd really better be getting on, old chap," set off on the road again and over the toilsome way they had come. "Wherever are you going to, Ratty?" cried the tearful Mole, looking up in alarm. "We're going to find your home, of course, old fellow," replied the rat pleasantly. "You had better come along, for it will take some finding, and we shall want that nose of yours." "Oh, come back, Ratty, do!" cried the Mole, getting up and hurrying after him. "It's no good, I tell you. It's too late, and too dark, and the place is too far off, and the snow's coming, and I never meant to let you know I was feeling that way about it. It was all an accident and a mistake, and think of the river-bank and your supper." "Oh, hang the river-bank and supper too," said the rat heartily. "I tell you, I'm going to find this place now if I stay out all night. So cheer up, old chap, and take my arm, and we'll very soon be back there again." Still snuffling, pleading, and reluctant, Mole suffered himself to be dragged back along the road by his imperious companion, who, by a flow of cheerful talk and anecdote, endeavoured to beguile his spirits back and make the weary way seem shorter. When at last it seemed to Rat that they must be nearing the part of the road where Mole had been held up, he said, "Now, no more talking, business. Use your nose and give your mind to it." They moved on in silence for some little way, when suddenly the Rat was conscious, through his arm that was linked to Mole's, of a faint sort of electric thrill that was passing down the animal's body. Instantly he disengaged himself, fell back a pace and waited, all attention. The signals were coming through. Mole stood a moment rigid, while his uplifted nose, quivering slightly, felt the air. Then a short, quick run forward, a fault and a check, a try back, and then a slow, steady, confident advance. The Rat, much excited, kept close to his heels as the Mole, with something of the air of a sleepwalker, crossed a dry ditch, scrambled through a hedge, and nosed his way over a field open and trackless and bare in the faint starlight. Suddenly, without giving warning, he dived, but the Rat was on the alert and promptly followed him down the tunnel with his unerring nose and faithfully led him. It was close and airless, and the earthy smell was strong, and it seemed a long time to Rat until the passage ended, and he could stand erect and stretch and shake himself. The Mole struck a match, and by its light the Rat saw that they were standing in the open space that was neatly swept and sanded underfoot, and directly facing them was Mole's little front door, with Mole End painted in Gothic lettering over the bell pull on the side. Mole reached down a lantern from a nail on the wall and lit it, and the Rat, looking round him, saw that they were in some sort of forecourt. The garden seat stood on one side of the door, and on the other a roller, for the Mole, who was a tidy animal when at home, could not stand having his ground kicked up by other animals into little runs that ended up in earth heaps. On the wall hung wire baskets with ferns in them. Down one side of the forecourt ran a skittle alley, with benches along it, and little wooden tables marked with rings that hinted at beer mugs. In the middle was a small round pond containing goldfish and surrounded by a cockleshell border. Out on the centre of the pond rose a fanciful erection clothed in more cockleshells and topped by a large silvered glass ball that reflected everything all wrong and had a very pleasing effect. Okay, so that was the end of part 1. So you can see we've managed to get our way back to Mole's little house, which we haven't actually been in since the very beginning of chapter 1, when he gave up on his spring cleaning and wanted to go and explore in the fresh air. And he's used his nose and that kind of internal voice within animals that they know where their safe place is. And he's used that to help guide him back. So in the next part of chapter 5, we'll find out what Ratty and Mole get up to while they're in Mole's house, which obviously is very different to Ratty's home. So I wonder whether he'll like it. I'm sure he will. Okay, so the word of the day for this first part of chapter 5 is a word that I learnt today, and I'm struggling to pronounce it even now. So I'm going to put it up on the screen so you can see it. The sentence was, "The Rat, astonished and dismayed at the violence of Mole's paroxysm of grief." So a paroxysm of grief. So I want you to look up what that word means so we can make sense of that sentence. Okay, so return to the YouTube channel tomorrow so that you can hear the second part of chapter 5.